Securing the Realm.
Hello there, and welcome to Securing the Realm. And we've got another guest on our show today. So, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Josh McDonald.
Hi, I'm Chris Lloyd-Jones.
Hi, I'm Nema Sobhani.
Hey Nema, cheers for coming on. What are you here to talk about today? What do you do? Where are you from?
Cool. Sure. So I'm a data scientist by trade, but I've been working at Avanade in like 3 generations of data and AI, from traditional data science to Gen AI to agents now. So I work on the Avanade agentic platform at Avanade in the office of the CTO. And I basically come from a science background. So I was in research science initially, studying molecular biology, and then pivoted to big data and data science. So I would say I'm generally a scientist, but in data and AI today.
So, what kinds of things are you seeing from what you're working on? Maybe give a bit of an intro into what you are working on as well.
Sure. So we're working on an agentic platform that basically takes the Microsoft stack and ecosystem of agentic offerings and kind of wraps them into more of a business user and use case driven framework. So, we're providing some of the things you might not get out of the just direct technical box, such as, end-to-end governance frameworks, agentic lifecycle management, some of the dev test prod separation as well through user personas, as opposed to like deployments and CI/CD. So in that pipeline, effectively, we have, like I said, governance. And I guess one of the things that is top of mind there is evaluations, evaluators, metrics. How do you go from tech validation to business validation? And so we're trying to provide kind of all of that in addition to a playground where you build agents and doing the basic persistence layer, user management. So in terms of getting to that kind of business value use case functional boundary, we're really trying to solve for how do you manage the whole life cycle, including governance, technical validation, and business validation.
So that's really interesting because I've heard you mention agent quite a few times. You've also mentioned your science background and how you went from molecular biology to kind of traditional data science to Gen AI to agents. What does agent mean to you? Because I know in the academic literature, it used to mean something totally different, and there's still a lot of uproar about that. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I'll give a very informal definition, but to me, it's basically an AI entity that's empowered to do things. And you may say, well, can't Gen AI do that, right? The jump from us training classifiers and regression models to Gen AI. Gen AI was more in the summarization realm, just transforming your inputs into outputs. But then nowadays we've blurred the lines a little. But I think that agent definition boundary is really once you're able to call tools, execute functions or code, and to some extent do it autonomously. Now that last piece I think is more driven from the interaction pattern. So as a human, you may decide you have more or less freedom, or here's where I would like to be in the loop, or how strongly I enforce that. But from my understanding, I think it's really just about the ability to do things as opposed to just convert your input and transform that into another text output.
I like that. Why should people care that this is possible?
Yeah, because they're probably going to be your digital coworkers soon.
Or your boss.
Or your boss. I think that's really where we're going, is you're likely to engage with agents, whether you know it or not, probably more explicitly as time goes on in all of your business functions. You may also be empowered from, I think of 2 lenses with agents. There's kind of productivity assistance. When we think about Copilot, when we think about M3 Copilot, this is like your intern or assistant you can offload some tasks to. You can say, hey, summarize all the emails from Chris I got this week. I want to make sure nothing fell through the cracks. You can kind of do some of those more maybe simple, not very high human level judgment tasks. But to me, the part where it gets interesting is then you're going to have, instead of a proxy of mine that acts with a federated identity or impersonates me to get that info, you're going to talk about agents with their own identities who are, registered as an entity that are doing things in your ecosystem, and they may not have to go through you to do it, even if it touches work you do. So cross-functional, cross-org agents. So think of like an HR use case with IT, and we need to onboard someone, and there's an IT side to that, and inputting data. There is a sending that user onboarding materials, right? You're going to probably see agents that are crossing both of these. And then probably also you should care because how will this impact your org chart? How will this impact the way we think of the division of labor? Who owns what is another interesting challenge.
The org chart.
Yeah, right. Is an org chart even going to be necessary in the future? Or is that just one overlay to understand things like your career advising, like a hierarchy, but maybe moving towards work charts and understanding who does what and what does that touch, because it can be domain agnostic, right? Anyway, So trailing a little, but a lot of a lot of impact,
I love that.
potentially.
But there's so much there, like from skills finding to thinking, how do you pay and compensate people?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I
Also, what is
mean,
a human task, right? Like that's another piece is like we're trying to free up human time to focus on, or we're trying to automate some of the manual repeated tasks so that humans can focus on high value human activities. But we're finding that it just means that people are using agents for more stuff and maybe not necessarily pivoting to more of that high level human judgment oriented tasks.
I'm really pleased you touched on the idea of the work chart there. I know that was something that Asher Sharma kind of talked about a bit as well before going on to run Xbox, which is slightly different to that. Thinking of how agents are doing work, people are doing work, and how we talk about agents, do you feel like we're humanizing them too much? Like, what's the tech, the social impact of this, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you're seeing agents being named is kind of the maybe most like obvious example of this. I'm not sure to what extent that sticks around. I've seen a lot of attempts at naming agents and then that disappearing and then another generation of them and like here's Bert and here's Ada.
Yeah.
But
I have
yeah,
an agent called Roger at the moment.
yeah.
Maybe he's not destined for a very long life, you were saying.
If you look at like the distribution of human names, like generationally, there's like during Friends, the show, there was a lot of Rachels. I think we're going to see a lot of Jeeves and Alfreds in terms of the naming distribution because people are going to see these agents as butlers in a sense. Like, so again, it's like treating it as this butler, this entity that you can just offload work to and it reprimanded and is consoles you when you don't get the output you want and tells you what you want to hear because that's its only interest, right, in existing. But I think you're going to see almost like agents that are completely separated from human interaction as well, that are working under the scenes, that aren't really chat interface oriented agents, but more making just decisions, executing on decision tree paths based on evidence and so on. So from a
I
social
like that
perspective,
point.
yeah.
One thing I'd say is, so if generative AI, so your chat GPTs, your Copilot is almost trapping processes in Amber, kind of Jurassic Park style, you're asking questions, you're getting a response. How will add this ambient AI, like AI doing stuff for you behind the scenes, change things? Because some people are terrified. I had someone say to me recently, my agents are going to hack other agents. And I put my head in my hands a little bit. Is it more than just governing Markdown? Is there actually something that makes this difference? What is this?
Yeah, these are huge questions. I mean, like to me, my
Yeah,
brain
in
goes,
15 seconds, please.
yeah,
I'm
right.
joking.
To me, my brain goes immediately to the governance processes have to be evolved, not just thinking about the way you hire a human. Like you consider, someone's credentials. What are your skills and your abilities? Then you also consider their personality. Like, are you a good fit for our team? Are you nice or are you mean? You might have a need for different things in different industries, right? But for agents, this is a great pivot. So when you think about base models, we evaluate them based on kind of language arts concepts, right? Are you coherent? Semantically, is what you're saying correct? Is the context that you're provided, are you using that properly? Or are you hallucinating information, right? So, like, are you a trustable base model? And I kind of see that as the personality layer of like, what is the propensity of this model to kind of just not be pleasant? Or, the next piece it goes to like, what's your competence? And that's really how you evaluate agents, not just a base model, but how do you work within a team? How do you execute what your job is? So if you have, like, let's talk about that HR and IT crossover model, you might need to pull a read record from a database. You may also need to push some information into an HR system. I think the ability to do that is a completely different set of metrics. It's not just, are you coherent or doing this properly, but are you calling the right tool? Are you spending extra steps than you need to do that? And are you delegating or working with your team properly? I
So
think.
you've made me think something there.
Sure.
You talked about coherence. You talked about the type of work you might delegate. You talked about kind of the groundedness there. I would say, are we holding agents to a higher standard than we might hold humans because it's less impolite to do that? I mean, I was trying to book a gym session for Josh recently on Friday, and I emailed this company. I was like, I would like this time on this day, here's the full name, here's the email. And I got back, okay, great, what's the name? And I went, here's the name. What day? Here's the day. In the end, I copy pasted my initial thing. But that is a human, I assume, not being particularly coherent or grounded. What changes?
Yeah, you're talking almost about a propensity for abuse because of the soulless nature of the entity.
Maybe, but you're also holding the entity to a higher standard than we hold people. We let people be incoherent and ungrounded and not reading documents, but we're expecting our agents to because we think they'll be less fallible than us.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess two things here. We're talking about things that could potentially be personality oriented, but let's say someone's not very detail oriented at the counter of your gym. And you say, hey, I want to cancel my membership. And they say, okay, what's your name? Chris Lloyd Jones. Okay, what can I do for you today? It's like, I just told you, but maybe that person will do it in about 10 seconds. They're just really efficient. So there's maybe a difference between personality and competence. And sometimes we wrap them together. If someone misses a lot of details, I'm going to assume they're incompetent. But with these models, you can have any, breakdown and combination of these things. So I think, yes, we do hold it to a higher standard because it has explicit text memory that it can, refer to as photographic memory. So we hold Superman to a different, standard than a police officer. I think it's fair to hold, a model that has basically can hold a book in memory and reference that. It can use semantic search indexes, mimics human brain in a ton of different ways. I think it's fair to hold it to a standard of basic language oriented principles because it's language model. So, or at least in the context of chat interfaces, right?
Yeah.
But, semantics, accuracy, groundedness, coherence, relevancy, that it doesn't do something else than what you asked. Those are, again, the base model. So I think we will have more maybe conversational, personalized base models that are really good at interacting with people. That'll probably continue to get better and have all those weird implications that will have as well. But then the second piece is we might have some really not social or personable models that are excellent at executing things. So think of the difference between IT and HR,
Antisocial work models.
So I do think that, you're going to have that expectation of different models in different circumstances. So a chat interface, which is customer service, better be good at, understanding the core principles of customer service. It should be nice, should be conversational. It should be able to pull your information and ask what you need. But for an agent that's doing some critical IT thing, I think of Fergus and all those cool MTech examples. But this agent is monitoring a camera that's looking at a physical gauge. It also has a digital gauge and it has to make a call on when there's a discrepancy. I don't really care if that model's conversational. I want it to execute a path that ultimately results in action being taken and a technician arriving within a SLA or beating the SLA.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, it's such an interesting concept, though. Are people mean to models? Is clanker considered a curse word?
Well, maybe that's why you might see some of these scenarios like customer service being replaced with AI. And, at the same time, if you're going to replace a human activity with machine activity, maybe you do expect it to be better because the implications of all of that, maybe. You talked a lot about a lot of things I see as kind of quality factors or expectations, and of course there's been a lot of activity in the consumer, I'm going to call it, market, things like OpenClaw, which I deem a consumer product effectively when it comes to AI. But when we look at enterprise, does all this scale? And agents in the enterprise, how does it scale?
Yeah, so again, this comes back to kind of frameworks, I think. And so we have evaluation of performance. And so there are gates that you don't really allow something out into the wild until it passes that gate. I think they were more explicit in the past. So I'll do a quick generational reflection. But with the original kind of the big boom of data science, it was all around, classification, regression, clustering, problems. And you had really explicit metrics for that, right? The first challenge in this world was, okay, we know it works or it has a decent level of accuracy, but how do we explain the predictions? That was kind of the first battle. And there were tools that emerged, right? Black box model interpretation, surrogate models. You can fit a linear model to your black box model to explain those local predictions. But so that gave that business insight to actually take action, not just explain things through predictive analytics, but actually do things. With Gen AI, like we talked about some of these language arts approach, it's saying, I don't want to release this model to chat with my workforce until we've proven that it has a propensity to be consistent, stay nice, follow all of those language principles. But then beyond that it also will do what's asked of it in the correct amount of steps. And again, that's the pivot from agentic. But now talking about touching critical systems, I think that's where it's emerging and we're still figuring it out. There are some offers coming from the Foundry and Microsoft stack for agent evaluation. There's 3 major ones. But to me, these are the gates before, sure, it might have a conversational agent, but before you empower it to do like read operations, let alone CRUD operations against your database, you really need to consider, is this, what are your agentic metrics that are in the way of this stage gate? And so the ones we're seeing so far are intent classification, basically, like, does it understand what it's supposed to do based on how this agentic system, potentially many agents, behave? Is tool calling or tool fidelity? Does it know what tool to reach for, and is it calling it correctly? So this is akin to like, human trades, like, what's your skill with a hammer, or are you a good doctor, right? So tool calling effectively. And then the last one is just efficiency. Like, does this team work well together? Do they call the right person when they need them? Or do they iterate and spin their wheels a little bit, trying to figure out who owns this process or whatever else? So those three things are what I see emerging as, and it's not just the Microsoft framework. Yes, they have those evaluators, but you're seeing it across the other offers as well. So
yeah, like you see it in Claude Code, for example, you might spin up an agent team, you might ask one to go and fix some bugs, you paste in the bug, and then it loses context, it struggles, and the agent team lead's like, oh, I'll just go and fix it myself. And you're like, no, delegate properly, because a lot of the guardrails aren't necessarily there, the experts' skills haven't been defined. That's a pretty cool point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're asking, if I had to break it down, because it's like a huge kind of elephant to eat, but the first thing is like, what is your framework that prevents, like, how are you protecting your assets in the first place? What are the stage gates you're putting in place before you allow this kind of cumulative or increasing risk profile? So for me, the first thing is, like, if I'm going to even have a live connection to some data system, we're going to start with read only, and we're going to see how it operates in this environment. And let's say it passes all of your multiple levels of evaluations, right? If you have core metrics or business metrics, SLAs, that's one set. Then your tech validation of, the language arts evaluators, not hallucinating. And then we didn't even talk about this yet, but content safety and security is what you start introducing into this kind of space. Does it have a propensity to be hacked? Can you get it to leak information that might be in the system prompt? How does it deal with adverse attacks? How does it deal with like content safety evaluations? Like, does it have a propensity, because it's trained on the internet, which means it's trained on 4chan and Reddit? But like, does it have a propensity for that side to come out?
And how much do people need to care about that? So it's trained on all of this content. Like the human tradesperson scenario, it only has the tools that you've given it. So at what point do you start caring? At what point is it governing more than just Markdown?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it all comes down to those systems and those frameworks you have in place and the appropriate stage gating. But even with all of that, you're still assuming some risk. The same you do for people, right? An IT admin can extract a role of all employees and they can go do something with that, but there's a risk associated with that for them. They can have, punishment for that, but there is no equivalent for AI. So what happens when it deletes your code base and says, you're right, I didn't mean to do that. You did tell me not to do it.
I just didn't drop database.
Yeah. Beyond just telling a model, I've taken 1,000 points from you and watching it freak out, I guess there's nothing permanent you can do there.
Right. So there's no risk to that model. But yeah, I think, let me do it.
So if we've got a scenario around, AI explainability, the evaluation that you've done comes back and it's not really looking that great. How do you actually act on that data in this example?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in the past, you would look at things like bias and fairness examples. Like in a classifier, you can split your data intentionally to misrepresent, you could split your data to represent groups in different proportions that exist and do these analysis to basically see what comes back as, does it predict does it classify your models in the same way, or does it start changing to reveal biases? And then you can drill down into that. For these models, if you get back something that says, your banking model is biased because it asks to speak to the person's husband, right? That's like a really like silly but classic example we use in showing bias. Then do you simply go into your prompt and say, hey, by the way, here's an edge case, don't do this? Or do you select a different base model that might have been proven to do better with content safety? Or do you crank up content safety parameters for that model and maybe apply an intermediate model that will actually filter responses from your agent at the potential cost increase of having a secondary call for every call to your model? So it really depends on your risk aversion, your infrastructure, and your budget. But let's say it is a, really risk averse industry. Maybe it is worth that additional cost to have that mediation, because you might determine at some point, there is no way we can guarantee this, even if it does pass the evaluation. but by putting in a mediator of sorts or filtering. And in Azure OpenAI, they do allow content filtering out of the box, which is effectively doing the same thing. I think it's like a affordable model, like a 3.5 or something, sitting in between a lot of the calls. So I think it might just be additional processes or touch points in the way. But I think having the expectation that you do have like a really perfect model that doesn't have a propensity for, these content safety violations or being poisoned, I think that is something I wouldn't necessarily rely on. I prefer a system that corrects itself.
One thing that's really interesting there is you talked about affordability. I know it's not what we're focused on today, but it's funny that a model that a few years ago would have been really expensive is now, oh, that's a really cheap model. We're just like chucking stuff at that model. Like the model cost is like continuously being commoditized as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things you also touched on was around kind of some of the things that the agent would be doing and how it behaves in relation to a human. And it kind of brought me on to something that CLJ said a bit earlier, which was around, human activities. But what are human activities now if agents are capable of doing a lot of these things? Does it fit neatly into buckets? I'm not so sure, to be honest.
Yeah, this is such a good topic because it's philosophical and it makes us reflect and dive deep into what are the human things I do. If you guys are familiar with Suno, the music generation AI company. So I'm a musician. So if you think about it, if I'm editing some takes for a song I'm writing in my digital workstation, I might say I would love AI to edit the rest of these guitars or these vocals that are a little pitchy, but it's human performances. I would say that there is a line, and it might be hard to declare what is the human part and what is the part that if I automated, I wouldn't feel a guilt of like sacrificing some of my, my spirit, like the human spirit in the process. But I think that to me, it's like, it's not just about a delineation of, well, creative, tasks are human. Or things that require high level complex judgment, whereas everything else is AI. I'd be careful to necessarily divide it up that way because for some folks, they might enjoy doing something that I might see as a manual repeated task. So I can't simply say it that way. And I also don't want it to be just mojo where we say it's like, oh, it when you've crossed it, But to me, there's something very specifically different about, this is a productivity assistant, and I'll use music as an example, but I just recorded, a 5-minute song and I have tons of edits to do. And I tell some agent in my ecosystem, observe how I'm going to edit these guitars. I do about 1 or 2 minutes of editing and I say, now you go. And then I evaluate in the loop. That to me is very different than I want something a little bit rock, a little bit metal with pop vocals. If I write a paragraph and it generates what would take me 100 hours to generate, I would say like the difference is somewhere in there. It might be really easy intuitively to point out, but I also think it's really complex because it'll vary for each individual. But for me, like if I had to get really explicit with it, again, human judgment, human intuition, human creativity, the answer lies somewhere adjacent to these things, but I don't even know if I can pin it down. My philosophy is rusty.
I like her. You're like, I want to pin it down, can't pin it down yet. It needs to be more than Mojo to use the phrase that you're using. It's like car driving. I'm happy to drive. Don't love it. Long car journey, I'd quite happily have a self-driving car take over. Some people love it. And yet, the car safety, we might be going, well, if you want to drive in future, you're going to go to a car ranch and you won't get to drive your car in future.
Yeah. Or like Minority Report, like a dual scenario where on the highway systems, you're all just patched into the computer. Effectively, it's a train of individual pods. But, when you're off-road or rural, you get manual control, But in that system,
fun for people like to drive.
Right. But in that system, does it make sense to allow, when it's like a hive, to allow one unit to basically not follow that? Does it potentially put the whole other thing at risk? So it's like there has to be some type of social contract or agreement of that role that I'm not even going to touch.
Because I wouldn't let people drive separately, but that's me.
Yeah. Same.
Really is an interesting one. And it's very hard to put a box on it. And, what one person's box maybe is probably not another person's box that is AI stuff, but I'm going to try and ask you anyway. So what do you want AI to take from you and what do you want to keep?
Yeah, personally, I would like it to get rid of anything that doesn't require like a high level of human judgment. Curation or taste are words that come to mind. There's some things I just know how it should go and how to do it, given experience, knowing my colleagues, knowing the systems of my organization. And some of those things aren't very easy to convey, nor is there access to the tooling to bring all that together through an agent. So that's where I would like to operate, because I feel like that those are the big rocks to move, as opposed to getting bogged down in, let's say, like automation, security issues, making decks to convey information. That might be helpful for some folks. It's helpful for me. I love consuming decks, but I very rarely like making them. So that's my philosophical answer.
Too much of my life is spent in PowerPoint, quite honestly.
Right. So that's the high level. What the explicit thing would be, yeah, I don't want to make decks or like visual material to convey ideas that I could speak to. And if there's a conversion layer to just, I receive information visually. I like kind of Eli 5 versions of things. I like starting at, first principles and building up. So if someone is not like that at all, but they can convey information in a way they like to, but then I can receive it in a way I like to, I think that'd be a really good use of AI, like agents in particular. Convert this information, right? Transform it into a medium in which I consume well. But really what's happening is the exchange of ideas, thought leadership, right? Navigation, directional change for whether it's the platform or our teams, the way we work. So again, it's just like, it should support us in those actions, which I would say are human. But again, it's so hard to define because it is different for everyone.
Human today.
Yeah.
I do like that idea though, because it's allowing people to be human, and that what you'd categorize that, depending on who you are, what you do, and what your perception of the world and your worldview is, it could be entirely different ultimately.
So I'm going to have to cringe at that, because anyone that says be human, I love the intent behind it, but the phrase just makes me shudder a little bit.
That's fair.
So like with an asterisk, with guardrails, and those guardrails, we can talk about things like, that maximize pleasure, reduce pain, like whatever it is. It's funny when you think of all of these robot movies and sentience, like what are the guardrails that are typically given in sci-fi? It's things like maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And then, the classic example is the AI is like, whose pleasure and pain, right? Because if you do it generally, the first thing it does is wipes out humanity. And so it's like, there's an important thing there about humanity, but also more importantly, like what are the principles that we, this is like Hobbesian, but that we as
like
a social contract include.
Versus,
I was about to say, shout out to Jeremy Bentham apparently for maximize pleasure and reduce pain.
Yeah. And you were talking about SHAP too, Chris, that there's another SHAPS, that's what it's called, right? That has something to do with.
Yeah, there's another one which made me laugh. I was looking up SHAP scores the other day and made me laugh that there's another one as well, Shapley. There's SHAPS for anhedonia. So there's like many different SHAPS depending on what you're looking at.
Well, no, I really have enjoyed this conversation, Nema. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about, the scientific, the philosophical, and then everything in between and working really. So yeah, really appreciate you coming on. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.